Summer 1972. A $500 Dodge Dart just murdered a big block Camaro. The weapon? A grocery-getter Mopar Slant Six. Engineers called it a masterpiece. Executives called it an embarrassment. But on back roads from Australia to Pikes Peak, it sparked a revolution. This is the untold story of an engine that defied corporate sabotage, humiliated V8s, and built a cult that still thrives today. Birth of a rebel. By the late 1950s, Chrysler finally admitted what many already knew. Its ancient straight-six flathead just wasn't cutting it anymore. After nearly 30 years of powering everything from sedans to pickups, the 1929-era engine had officially worn out its welcome. But there was more at play than just outdated tech. America's post-war love affair with sleek, oversized cruisers was suddenly cooling off. Across the Atlantic and Pacific, imports from Volkswagen, Fiat, and Datsun are flooding American showrooms, offering nimble handling, sippable fuel economy, and sticker prices that make Detroit's V8s look like dinosaurs. Chrysler knew it had to pivot. Fast. That meant building a smaller, more efficient engine and a brand new compact car to house it. Enter the Valiant. It's a car designed to compete with the likes of the VW Beetle and Ford's new Falcon, a vehicle for a new era of budget-conscious buyers, young families, urban commuters, and small-town dreamers. But there was a big problem. The all-new inline-six engine Chrysler had proudly engineered didn't fit in the Valiant's smaller engine bay. The market's sudden shift toward small, efficient automobiles forced Detroit's hand. Chrysler needed not only a compact, affordable engine, but also an entirely new car to wrap around it. Thus began the development of the Valiant chassis. But there was an immediate snag. The newly designed inline-six engine wouldn't fit in the Valiant's smaller engine bay. Hood clearance was the first issue. Then came the forward-mounted water pump, which pushed the limits even further. The engine was just a bit too tall and a bit too long, especially once you factored in essential accessories. In a smoky Chrysler engineering room, project leader Willem Weertman gathers his team for a late-night brainstorming session. Coffee cups litter the table, and the air smells of sweat and graphite. Days of head-scratching yield no easy answers. Lowering the hood means compromising cooling. Shortening the engine risks gutting its power. Every solution seems to create a new problem. Then, in a moment of exhausted clarity, Weertman proposes a radical idea. "What if we tilt it?" he asks, half-joking. By canting the engine 30 degrees to the right, the team realizes they can solve the hood clearance issue in one stroke. The cooling fan stays aligned with the radiator, and the engine's overall height shrinks just enough to fit. But the tilt alone isn't enough. The forward-mounted water pump, a bulky necessity, still protrudes too far. So, they relocate it to the side, a clever move that frees up precious space. To keep the engine balanced, they offset the mounts slightly to one side, ensuring the drivetrain remains stable. Just like that, the Valiant project is back on track. They call it the Slant Six, a name as unpretentious as the engine itself. "We wanted an engine that was efficient but tough," Weertman later wrote in his 1985 Chrysler engineering memoir. "The Slant Six was our answer to doing more with less." It wasn't just a fix, it was a revolution. The 30-degree tilt wasn't just about fitting under a hood. It gave mechanics better access to components, made maintenance easier, and kept the engine's center of gravity low for better handling. The Slant Six debuted in 1960, powering not just the Valiant, but also the Dodge Dart Lancer and even upscale models like the Chrysler Imperial. It was the Swiss Army knife of engines, versatile, reliable, and ready for anything. When the Valiant first hit the streets, Chrysler offered the Slant Six with an aluminum engine block. It sounded cutting edge, and in many ways, it was. Aluminum was primarily reserved for exotic race cars and aircraft. Chrysler adopting it in the Slant Six was a bold move. "We were inspired by European engines," said Robert Sinclair, a junior engineer on the team, in a 1992 Hemmings Motor News interview. Aluminum was the future, but Chrysler's bean counters weren't ready for it. But in reality, most Slant Sixes rolled off the line with traditional cast iron blocks. Why? Simplicity and cost. Aluminum might have been innovative, but it was far more difficult to produce. Between lukewarm public interest and constant production headaches, Chrysler quietly shelved the aluminum block option not long after launch. Internally, the engine was no slouch. The pistons were made of a tin-plated aluminum alloy, and the 225 variant featured chrome-plated steel for its top piston ring. That wasn't just for durability. It was Chrysler's answer to oil consumption issues that had plagued earlier engines. As for the cylinder heads, the Slant Six borrowed heavily from Chrysler's B-Series V8s. This wasn't just a case of parts bin engineering. It was a strategic move. The heads were proven performers, familiar to dealership technicians, and kept costs down. It was budget-friendly brilliance: reuse what works, simplify maintenance, and make mechanics' lives easier. The Slant Six also came with a bizarre, efficiency-obsessed intake manifold, affectionately known by gearheads as the bunch of bananas. This design wasn't just for show. Because the intake and exhaust ports lived on the same side of the engine, Chrysler needed a way to make everything fit under the hood, especially with the engine leaning to the right. So the manifold was engineered to snake around everything like a jungle vine. The benefit? Faster warm-up times for the intake air, which helped Chrysler meet the U.S. government's new emissions regulations. The downside? Those twisted, unequal runners killed performance and ensured that incoming air was anything but cool. David versus Goliath. But Chrysler wasn't blind to the fact that some of its valiant buyers wanted a bit more performance. So 426 Hemi mastermind, Tom Hoover, was tasked with developing a solution. And that's the Slant Six Hyperpack. Built for NASCAR's first and only compact car race at Daytona, the Hyperpack Slant Six was no joke. The Hyperpack was no ordinary six-cylinder. It boasted a 4-barrel Carter carburetor, a long-runner intake manifold, a hotter camshaft, stiffer valve springs, domed pistons, and tubular headers. The 170 cubic inch version churned out 148 horsepower, while the 225 model unleashed a jaw-dropping 196 horsepower, numbers that made big block engine drivers sweat. At Daytona, driver Ronnie Householder piloted a Hyperpack Valiant to 7 wins in NASCAR's compact division, leaving bigger cars in the dust. It wasn't just fast, Householder said in a 1961 Hot Rod interview. It was relentless. Chrysler didn't stop at the track. They offered a detuned Hyperpack kit through Mopar dealers, letting everyday drivers taste the magic. The street version wasn't quite as wild, but it still packed enough punch to embarrass small block V8s at stoplight showdowns. Recognizing the growing appetite for more power, Chrysler rolled out a bigger version of the Slant Six with that same year's lineup. It kept the same engine bay footprint, but got a 1-inch longer stroke for more displacement and torque. This required a new crankshaft, taller deck height, and longer rods and push rods, transforming the engine's entire personality. And while the valiant Hyperpack got its time in the spotlight, the real star was the 225. It quickly became Chrysler's go-to six-cylinder for everything from Dodge pickups to Plymouth land yachts. Thanks to its compact slanted design, it fits virtually anywhere. Surprisingly, Chrysler never bothered to straighten out the engine, even when space wasn't an issue. Trucks and full-size sedans got the same tilted treatment, making maintenance a knuckle-busting affair. Reaching fuel pumps and distributors meant diving elbow-deep into the darkest corners of the engine bay because convenience clearly wasn't the Slant Six's strong suit. The Slant Six evolved quickly. From its release in 1960 all the way up until 1971, an array of different camshafts and cam timing came and went. These were accompanied by a ton of different carburetors and ignition mapping combos for meeting tightening emission standards and for toying with things like compression ratios. It also didn't take long for the heads to receive a redesign for the 1963 model year, as efficiency, performance, and emissions concerns continued to torment the automobile industry. This resulted in those leaky, washerless spark plug tubes being utilized, which remained in play all the way up until the mid-1970s. In 1967, things got a bit more performance-packed, with the 170 variant receiving a beefier carburetor and the camshaft from the 225. This was attached to an overhauled head that was intended to increase economy and power. 2 years later, in 1969, a carburetor de-icer apparatus, using air that had been heated by the exhaust, was applied to the 225 version of the Slant Six. Across the globe, the Slant Six found a second home in Australia, where Chrysler's local arm built it under license. Aussie engineers saw the engine's potential and went wild. In 1970, they unveiled the cross-flow Hemi head for the Valiant VG Pacer, a six-cylinder that could shame V8s. The Hemi head, with its efficient cross-flow design and hemispherical combustion chambers, boosted power to 165 horsepower in stock form, with tuners pushing it far higher. Paired with Weber carburetors and aggressive cam profiles, the Aussie Slant Six became a street legend. The VG Pacer, with its bold stripes and snarling exhaust, was Australia's answer to the American muscle car, proving the Slant Six could play dirty on any continent. The Slant Six's racing cred didn't stop at Daytona or the Outback. At Pikes Peak, driver Jim Pascal pushed a Slant Six-powered Valiant to victory in the early 1960s, mastering the mountain's treacherous curves. "It's not about raw power," Pascal said in a 1964 Motor Trend interview. "It's about staying alive lap after lap." The Slant Six's balance and torque made it a hill climb hero. Bulletproof legend. The Slant Six's reputation for bulletproof reliability was lived daily by the people who drove them. By 1965, the 225 version had become Chrysler's workhorse, powering everything from Plymouth Valiants and Dodge Darts to trucks, vans, and even stationary industrial equipment. This was the engine you could pour abuse into and still expect it to start on a freezing Monday morning. Owners routinely reported engines that breezed past 150,000 miles with little more than oil changes and fresh spark plugs, an astonishing feat in an era when 100,000 miles was considered the graveyard for most engines. One of the most iconic stories came out of New York City. In a 1979 Motor Trend interview, a cab driver named Sal Moretti bragged about his Dodge Aspen's 225 Slant Six clocking 400,000 miles. "Just oil and spark plugs," he said. "It's a tank." He wasn't exaggerating. His taxi, battered and sun-faded, outlasted most cars in his fleet, earning the nickname Old Reliable among his fellow drivers. The engine's endurance wasn't confined to city streets. In rural America, farmers put Slant Sixes to work in irrigation pumps and generators. A 1963 Popular Mechanics article profiled one such pump that ran 24/7 for nearly 6 months straight without a breakdown. "It's the kind of engine you forget about," the author quipped, "because it never gives you trouble." The secret to the Slant Six's resilience lay in its design. With a rugged 7-main-bearing crankshaft, it distributed internal forces evenly, minimizing wear over time. Its simple single-barrel Carter carburetor and absence of complex electronics meant fewer parts to fail and easier fixes when they did. One Chrysler engineer once described it as an engine you could throw into a volcano and still pull out running. Mechanics loved it too. Its tilted design provided easy access to plugs and components, and its straightforward layout meant even backyard tinkerers could rebuild one with little more than a wrench and some determination. Ex-user Mopar Mike shared a photo in 2023 of his 1966 Dart's pristine engine bay, saying, "You could rebuild a Slant Six with a wrench and a screwdriver. I did it, twice. Even junkyards have tales to tell." A Michigan auto recycler recounted a customer in 2010 who asked for a replacement Slant Six. "You won't find one here," he said. "Every Slant Six we get still runs. They don't die, they get repurposed. Hot rodders threw turbos on them. Australians adapted them into Hemi-headed hybrids. Racers squeezed more horsepower than Chrysler ever imagined. But at its core, the Slant Six's magic wasn't in being the fastest. It was in being the last one running when everything else gave up." The legacy of the Slant Six as a tuner's sleeper engine only grew with time. While the factory rarely marketed it as a performance power plant after the Hyperpack experiment, backyard builders and drag strip tinkerers knew better. The engine's overbuilt bottom end, especially the 225's beefy crank and thick cylinder walls, made it ideal for experimentation. Want to slap on a turbo? No problem. Bolt a supercharger to it? Sure. Nitrous? Why not? In the 1980s and 90s, the Slant Six saw a small renaissance in grassroots racing circles. Budget-conscious racers discovered that with junkyard parts and some clever engineering, they could build a motor that would surprise small-block engines. One notable build was by Kansas native and drag racer Bill Rhea, whose 1965 Barracuda ran consistent 12-second quarter miles with a bored-out 225 and home-brewed intake setup. People laughed at first, Rhea said in a 1993 CarCraft article, but they stopped laughing when I left them at the tree. Today, the Slant Six remains a cult classic. Social media and YouTube are filled with tribute builds, resto mods, and full-throttle passes showcasing what this slanted wonder can still do. Despite Chrysler dropping the engine in the late 80s, parts availability remains strong thanks to an enthusiastic aftermarket and loyal fan base. As one YouTuber put it in a 2022 video titled, "Why the Slant Six Refuses to Die," you can bury it in sand, run it dry, blow it up, and it'll still ask for more. However, the Slant Six's brilliance wasn't universally celebrated. To Chrysler's engineering team, it was a proud invention. With its unconventional 30-degree tilt, cast-iron durability, and a promise of long-term reliability, it was exactly what the future demanded. But to Chrysler's top executives and the marketing department, it was a square peg in an engine-shaped hole. Dealers thought 6 cylinders were boring, admitted Robert Anderson, a former Chrysler executive, in a 1990 CarCraft interview. They told us, "Nobody's buying a Valiant for performance. Give us a Hemi." The Slant Six, especially the 225 version producing a modest 145 horsepower, was instantly branded as a grandma engine. This internal clash between visionary engineers and profit-driven executives nearly killed the Slant Six before it ever turned a crankshaft. It wasn't just about horsepower, it was about Chrysler's identity during a time when image often mattered more than innovation. Chrysler's identity was built on fire-breathing big blocks, the Firepower Hemi, the 440 Magnum, the 426 Street Hemi. A 6-cylinder, no matter how clever, didn't fit the image. Chrysler's engines were the darlings of drag strips and showrooms, and the Slant Six threatened to steal their thunder. The tension reached its boiling point in a now infamous 1958 boardroom meeting. Marketing and sales executives presented a proposal to kill the Slant Six altogether. In its place, they wanted a detuned version of Chrysler's 318, arguing it would offer the sizzle needed to compete with Ford and GM. Willem Weertman, the engine's chief architect, stood his ground. "We were told the Slant Six was a loser," he later wrote in his engineering memoir. "They said it wouldn't sell, that it was too plain for the American market." Despite being outnumbered and outranked, Weertman and his team came armed with hard data. The Slant Six's lower production cost, its perfect fit for the Valiant's compact chassis, its superior fuel economy and projected reliability, and the growing market of budget-conscious post-war families who didn't want a gas-guzzling engines. "We had to fight tooth and nail," Weertman wrote. "The executives didn't understand that reliability could sell cars. Ironically, it wasn't the passion of engineers or the wisdom of marketers that saved the engine. It was the accountants. Chrysler's budget was stretched to the limit. Millions were already being poured into their next-gen Firepower Hemis and B-Series. Developing a new engines for the Valiant from scratch was simply too expensive. "The bean counters saved us," recalled Robert Sinclair, a junior engineer on the Slant Six team, in a 1992 Hemmings Motor News interview. "They didn't want to spend the money on a new V8, so the Slant Six got the nod." But this victory came with a price. Yes, the Slant Six was approved for production, but with minimal marketing support. Chrysler's advertising budget would focus on their high-performance Dodges and Plymouths. The Valiant, and the revolutionary engine inside it, was left to quietly prove itself on its own merit. No flashy ads, no magazine covers, no track day hype, just grit. Was this neglect accidental? or something more sinister? Some gearheads believe Chrysler deliberately downplayed the Slant Six to protect their V8 ego. They didn't want a six-cylinder stealing the spotlight, said Dale Inman, a NASCAR crew chief, in a 1970 stock car racing interview. The Slant Six could have been a monster, but the suits kept it on a leash. The Slant Six's carburetor saga only fueled the conspiracy. When it came to Slant Six carburetors, Chrysler blew through them so fast. It all began with the humble Carter BBS, the baseline choice from the engine's birth in 1960, sticking around on cars through 1971 and on trucks until 1974. But things quickly got out of hand once Chrysler started experimenting with multi-barrel setups. The first major upgrade came in 1962 with the Holly 1920, a single-barrel carb that stayed a Slant Six staple for over a decade. But even then, there were quirks. Some 1963 models randomly received the Stromberg WA3, no one's quite sure why, and manual versus automatic transmissions often meant entirely different carburetors altogether. It was chaos, as if Chrysler was throwing darts at a parts bin. They never gave the Slant Six a consistent platform. It's like they wanted it to stay in the shadows. The final insult. Chrysler's feedback carburetor was a disaster. One mechanic snarled, "It ran like a drunk kangaroo." By 1987, it was dead in the USA, but in Mexico and Australia, it outlived its rivals until 1992. The 1970s were a dark time for American automakers. Emissions regulations tightened like a noose, and the Slant Six wasn't spared. By 1973, the Holly 1920 carburetor gave way to the leaner Holly 1945, designed to meet stricter emissions laws. But gearheads hated it. It choked the engine's torque, turning the 225 into a shadow of its former self. Many swapped it for older carbs or aftermarket setups, desperate to restore the engine's soul. In 1975, the 198 cubic inch Slant Six was axed, unable to keep up with emissions rules, leaving the 225 as the sole survivor. From this point forward, all Slant Six engines would share the same displacement and a growing list of compromises. Still, Chrysler tried to make the best of it. That same year, the Slant Six got a new cylinder head, intended to fix the long-standing issue of leaky spark plug tubes, a problem that had annoyed mechanics and do-it-yourself alike for years. The new design eliminated the tubes altogether and brought back the crush washer setup from early production models, which offered a tighter seal and cleaner combustion chambers. But there was a catch. This supposedly improved head design had a flaw of its own. It required complete cylinder head removal just to replace or adjust the valve lifters. What once was a relatively simple job became a weekend wrecking ordeal. And for a lot of owners, the question quickly became whether the Slant Six was still worth the hassle, or if it was finally starting to show its age in an industry that was rapidly moving on. Mechanics groaned, and owners cursed. "It's like they fixed one problem and created three more," wrote a frustrated mechanic in a 1976 Mopar action letter. It was around this same time that new federal emissions regulations began tightening their grip on automakers across the United States, and the Slant Six was no exception. In 1975, Chrysler was forced to fit catalytic converters into its entire lineup. Overnight, the once mighty 225 Slant Six was reduced to a shadow of itself. Output dropped to a dismal 95 horsepower and 185 pound-feet of torque. A far cry from the spirited launches and torque-rich mid-range that had once defined this engine's reputation. But the regulations didn't stop there. The government also pushed Chrysler to abandon mechanical lifters in favor of quieter, emissions-friendly hydraulic units. That required a regrind on the rear of the camshaft to reroute more oil to the top end. It was a complicated fix, costly, and not entirely reliable. Internally, some engineers grumbled that they were being forced to cripple a perfectly good engine to satisfy bureaucrats who'd never opened a hood. Then came 1976. In a move driven more by bean counters than engineers, Chrysler replaced the forged steel crankshaft with a cast iron unit. It saved money, sure, but it also sacrificed durability. one of the Slant Six's most sacred qualities. 3 years later, the company tried to save even more with the introduction of lightweight aluminum intake manifolds fused together with their flashy new electron beam welding process. It looked good on paper. In practice, it was a disaster. These intakes became notorious for cracking, warping, and letting vacuum leaks run wild. Mechanics hated them. Drivers hated them. Even the mechanics started calling them Friday afternoon manifolds, built by workers eager for the weekend. By 1981, Chrysler's desperation was palpable. In a bid to keep the Slant Six alive just a little longer, Chrysler slapped an electronic feedback carburetor on top. It was supposed to be an innovation, a Holley carb mated with an oxygen sensor to auto-tune the air-fuel mixture in real time. Sounds fancy, right? Well, it was, in theory. In practice, it was a Frankenstein of wires, vacuum lines, and wishful thinking. The Holley carburetor sputtered, sensors failed, and owners were left with engines that ran rich, surged at idle, or stalled altogether. The smell of unburned fuel wasn't just a sign of inefficiency. It was the scent of an engineering dream slowly dying. One disgruntled technician at the time quipped, "It's like they were trying to turn a workhorse into a show pony using duct tape and borrowed tech from a microwave." And yet Chrysler kept trying. There were fleeting experiments with turbocharging, a handful of prototypes for fuel injection, even blueprints for a diesel variant, all shelved in favor of cheaper, more modern alternatives. One by one, these ideas were killed off, either in boardrooms or testing labs. By 1984, the Slant Six was living on borrowed time. It was relegated solely to trucks in North America, and even then, only with a sad little single-barrel carburetor. Gone was the Super Six. Gone was the two-barrel setup. What remained was a neutered version of a once glorious power plant, quietly fading from the American road. Ironically, it was south of the border where the Slant Six held on the longest. In Mexico, production continued well into the late 80s, and by the early 90s, the engine saw one final forgotten resurrection: marine use. That's right, boats, and not even high-performance ones. The same engine that once left big block Camaros choking in its wake was now hauling bait. It was a tragic end for a mechanical legend. A power plant that had once punched above its weight, now wheezing under the burden of bureaucracy, budget cuts, and Band-Aid engineering. The Slant Six's decline felt like a betrayal. Was it just emissions laws and budget cuts, or did Chrysler's big block obsession finally kill it? Some enthusiasts swear it was sabotage. They neutered it to save the big block engines, posted ex-user Mopar Truth in 2023. Why else would they let a legend die like that? But the Slant Six wasn't done. Because while Chrysler gave up on the Slant Six, a different kind of legacy was quietly brewing. One forged in junkyards, back-alley garages, and illegal street races. Tinkerers, tuners, and mad scientists across the globe refused to let the Slant Six die. Some took the old Aussie crossflow heads and rewrote the rulebook. Others went full Frankenstein with twin turbos and fuel injection. And in a few rare cases, the Slant Six re-emerged, faster and angrier than anyone at Chrysler ever imagined. A Kansas racer, Bill Rhea, built a 225 that ran 12-second quarter miles, as documented in a 1993 CarCraft article. "People laughed," Rhea said, "until I smoked them." Legends never die, they're reborn. The Mopar Slant Six was never meant to be a legend. It was born to save Chrysler from a compact car crisis, dismissed as a grandma engine and buried under big block hype. Yet it outlasted its critics, powered millions of miles, and inspired a global cult of tuners who saw what Chrysler wouldn't: a six-cylinder with a V8's heart. From Ronnie Householder's NASCAR wins to Jim Pascal's Pikes Peak triumphs, from Australian Hemi-headed pacers to backyard turbo builds, the Slant Six proved one thing: you don't need 8 cylinders to leave a legacy. So, was the Slant Six intentionally detuned to protect Chrysler's engine ego? Did corporate politics clip its wings, or was it just a victim of a changing world? What do you think? Would you take a turbo Slant Six over a Hemi? The shocking truth: Chrysler's archives reveal one damning fact. The Slant Six cost 60% less to build than a big block engine. It could have saved Chrysler from bankruptcy if ego hadn't intervened. This is Paul from Rare Car Stories, and this cult is just getting started.